Hello, I think we're live. Yeah, great. Well, thanks everybody for joining us. We are going to leave the room open here for about 5 minutes before we get started. So if you're joining us live, just hang out for a couple minutes here. And if you're watching this after the fact, feel free to just skip ahead in the video, so you don't have to, just get right to the program. But yeah, for all of those you who are joining us live, thank you, welcome. This is the return of our History Speaks lecture series online. And yeah, I'm going to be talking about some dairy farming, which is always a very fun and relevant topic here in Marathon County. Let's see. While I'm checking everything, let me take a moment to tell you about some stuff, get some business out of the way here. Big thanks to our sponsor this year, Yankee Bookstore. They've been sponsoring the History Speaks program for 2021. And I'll also take an opportunity to thank all of our members for their support of the of local history. If you're not a member and you enjoy these sort of programs, it's a great place to start to support, and you get all sorts of nice benefits, like, for example, a free tour of the Yawkey House, which, by the way, is now open. We're back to doing tours at the Yawkey House at a regular hourly tours. So it's a great opportunity to get our newsletter, all sorts of benefits, and you get to support local history. So yeah, if you want to know more about that, feel free to go to our website, marathoncountyhistory.org, or come on by, give us a call. And yeah. But yeah, obviously, big thanks to Yankee for the sponsorship for this year. Also, let me take a moment to tell you about next month's History Speaks, because we're a little ahead of it this time. So I actually have a graphic for you. So this is the Grand Army of the Republic. This will be a presentation by Brett Barker, always a great speaker, very knowledgeable about the Civil War era American history. And this is one of those topics. So he's going to get into the Union soldier veteran group, and really one of America's, as you can see from the subtitle, America's most powerful veterans organization for its time. So it's going to be a very interesting topic. That'll be next month, Saturday, September 18th, again at 2 p.m. Same place you're watching it right here. I guess while I am talking about stuff that's coming up, let me also take a moment to say, hey, next month, or not next month, next weekend, the Marathon County Parks Department is going to be having a big celebration, 100 plus one parks anniversary. 100 years ago, and then one more year. We were going to do this last year, but obviously COVID had created some problems, as it did. But hey, 100 years ago, back in 1920, we had the Marathon County Parks Department was established. So they're gonna have a big celebration. We'll be there with the booth. So yeah, be a fun opportunity to get out and see Marathon Park. This is at Marathon Park next Saturday from 3 to 9:30. So that's coming up too. All right, I'm just gonna take a moment to check in before we. Great. All right, I should do that. Bear with me just a second here. Cool. All right. Well, I think we're getting close to the 2 o'clock here, so I think we'll maybe turn it over and get started. So it's my pleasure to introduce to you this afternoon our speaker, Christine Kadonsky, who local high school teacher in history at Wausau West. And yeah, she's going to be talking about some dairy farming. So just going to hit the, oh, there you go. Take it away.
And it says
And
muted?
it's muted?
Well, or the red
No,
is good?
it's blinking. It should be
Great.
good. Yeah.
Well, good afternoon. Thanks for joining us, whether here live or watching later. Thanks to our sponsor and to the members of the Historical Society. I'm really glad to be speaking with you today about History Speaks. Farming and Marathon County are close to my heart. Wausau is my hometown, and I do have connections to dairy farming. And so I'm really honored to have the opportunity to speak with you today a little bit about how Wisconsin started as wheat farming and then why we made the transition to dairy farming. But I'd also like to take some time to talk to you as well about Marathon County and the difficulties of starting farming here in the 1800s. Just a little bit about my personal history is that I have dairy farming on both sides of my family. So both sets of my grandparents owned and operated dairy farms, meaning that both of my parents grew up on dairy farms. My maternal grandparents, Amby and Elaine Shue, ran a dairy farm on Colby Factory Road in the town of Colby, which is about 45 minutes on the highway west of here, just over the border into Clark County. And my grandmother still lives on a portion of this property in their retirement home today. You may be aware, of course, that Colby has a claim to fame as the home of Colby cheese. Joseph Steinwand created this cheese in 1885, and it was rather unique and became very popular during its time. And he named it for the town that was nearby, Colby, which had been named for one of its founding members. You may be aware that for the past year or two, a group of committed residents in Colby have been lobbying the state legislature to have Colby cheese named the official Wisconsin state cheese. It went as a bill again before the legislature in July, but I haven't heard anything else about it since then. It is for certain a cheese invented in Wisconsin. Apparently, brick cheese was invented as well, so this designation is not without controversy. But as someone whose grandparents' milk went to the Colby Cheese Factory, I obviously am rather proud of my cheesehead status. And I remember the milk truck coming by whenever we'd visit the farm, and that we could get Colby cheese before you could even legally sell it on the market. So every time it was squeaky cheese. It barely held its form. It was so fresh. And on the other side of my family, my paternal grandparents, George and Elizabeth Kadonsky, owned and operated a dairy farm in the town of Holton. And so that's a township between Abbotsford and Dorchester. It's on the western edge of Marathon County. And both of them have since passed away, but my grandfather, who lived to be 90, was born in that house on the homestead and lived there his entire life. And it was my great-great-grandparents who purchased the farm in 1878. They were just the second family to be on the farm, so technically not a homestead, but some of that land is still in my family today. And this is what the house looks like, the farmhouse, and one of their machinery sheds. And in the front was my grandfather's wood shop. And he was making furniture up until the last years of his life. So I am a city girl through and through. 4-H was in my family's history, starting with my great-great-uncle who started Marathon County 4-H as a professor, Frank Kadonsky, at the UWMC, or University of Wisconsin-Stevens Point, Wausau. And so I was in 4-H, but I never showed animals, and I didn't have a great deal of interest in the farm or the barn itself, but I am proud of that family heritage. So today, I'm going to begin by talking to you about the big story of Wisconsin and the fact that many people don't know that Wisconsin actually began in about the mid-1800s with wheat farming. But by the end of the 1800s, dairy farming has really taken off. And so we'll talk about why that transition happened. And in the second half of the presentation, I want to come to here to Marathon County. We're not going to talk about wheat because Marathon County farms are really being homesteaded after that transition has taken place. But we'll talk about the difficulties that you face as you're trying to start a farm from native land. Speaking of native lands, of course, all of Wisconsin was owned by Native American tribes for hundreds and thousands of years. And this map shows us the tribal nations and their land holdings in about 1800. And so it's important to acknowledge, while white settlers considered Wisconsin, the frontier, the whole West, to be undeveloped, they considered it to be empty land for the taking and development. We know, of course, that there are native people here. And so in our community, if you look at the center of the state, much of Marathon County and to the north of us was traditionally Ojibwe land. But as you look up what would be the Wisconsin River, Wausau itself, and going down to Stevens Point, traditionally was Menominee land. And so this was a confluence of Native American cultures, and there was conflict over centuries over who controlled this area. It was seen as highly valuable, especially because of the rivers here in our region. So remembering that there were Native people there, let's talk about the white settlers as they arrived. Early Wisconsin agriculture. It does start, all white settlements started in the southern part of Wisconsin, and the prairie lands are the first to start farming because they were the most easily to be accessible, because a lot of the early settlers are coming from the East Coast. The land is conducive to farming, and it doesn't have quite the same forest growth that we have up here, closer to the North Woods. And wheat is the earliest and most important cash crop here in Wisconsin for white settlers. Part of the reason for that is that you didn't need a lot of capital investment to get it started. It also was a fairly easy crop to grow. You didn't need a lot of technical expertise. You could also get 2 crops of wheat in per year. So the high rate of financial return made wheat especially attractive for these first homesteaders. So again, I'm going to be using the word homestead as in you're coming across land that has never been developed in a farming sense. And this is beginning in about the 1835 to 1850. Real homesteading is happening where you are just trying to get it to the point where you can grow something. And then from the 1850s to the 1870s, wheat is the primary crop here in Wisconsin. And it really is important. The whole time period is from 1840 to 1880. Wisconsin is growing wheat and becomes given the nickname of America's bread basket. 1/6 of the wheat grown in the U.S. was grown here in Wisconsin. By the time of the Civil War, by 1860, Wisconsin was producing the second highest wheat yield in the U.S. So we know that the early success of wheat farming really gives Wisconsin agriculture a step up compared to other frontier states. We found a crop that worked here well very quickly among the white settlers. But of course, we know that that doesn't last. And so here are some of the problems with wheat farming. And this is particularly the case after the Civil War. So we're talking in the late 1860s. Wisconsin farmers start to move away from wheat and look for alternatives. Wheat was hard on the soil. In particular, it depletes the nitrogen. And you couldn't count on a consistent yield from year to year. Wheat in particular, you have to worry about the weather conditions and then insect infestations. There were these awful bugs that would come sometimes, and then a disease known as wheat rust. And so in a good year, it could be very good, but in a bad year, it could be bad. And you couldn't, it was a fairly volatile industry then. Also, by the late 1850s, the price of wheat began to drop because Wisconsin farmers have more competition from further west, Iowa, Minnesota, and eventually the Dakotas. And part of the reason they're continuing to grow those crops further west, they don't have the same depletion of the soil, but railroads have come through. And so with the development of the railroads, crops can more easily be transported to the East Coast because the vast majority, 2/3 of Wisconsin's wheat crop, was being exported out of the state. We were definitely selling this as a cash crop. And with the railroads, you could continue to grow wheat further and further west. So that brings the transition to dairy farming. And we'll talk about why they choose dairy farming. It expanded quickly in the late 1800s. I was surprised to learn that by the turn of the century, by 1899, more than 90% of Wisconsin farms were raising dairy cows. So the transformation was almost complete. What they came to realize is that we do have good soil here in Wisconsin, but it's better for growing feed crops, crops to feed your animals. We also had quite a few people migrate here from New York. And many of these New Yorkers brought with them experience in dairy. And so as the wheat industry or farming was winding down, this was something they were already familiar with. Now, of course, you would realize that you aren't going to be selling milk itself because this is the time before refrigeration. And so almost all of the farms are ultimately producing cheese. Some butter is being produced as well, but butter doesn't last as long without refrigeration either. And so with an emphasis on cheese, you're aware of course, that many European immigrants are coming in. And so German and Scandinavian immigrants, Polish immigrants as well, many of them have experience with dairy, and particularly they bring with them recipes for European style cheeses. And once those get to the market, they prove to be really popular with consumers. There are a couple of other factors that lead to the growth of dairy in Wisconsin, and one is William Hord. So this is because for 50 years he publicizes the industry here in Wisconsin. In 1872, he started Wisconsin Dairymen's Association in Watertown. And it was meant to be a marketing association, today like the Milk Board, but or the Dairy Board. But the association also understood that if they were going to convince more people to go into dairy, that they needed to provide some education. So that was through its publications, but also holding meetings in order to provide more information to people so that dairy could continue to increase in Wisconsin. Probably one of his lasting legacies was the creation of a dairy newspaper called Hord's Dairyman. And it started in 1885, and it very quickly became the nation's leading dairy magazine. And here's just one example of the front page of the magazine in 1899. Many dairy farmers in Wisconsin were reading this on a regular basis, and it kept them up to date on the latest technology, scientific research, and it was also full of advertising. And so it would show you all of the possibilities of farm implements available to you. Another factor helping with the growth in knowledge about dairy farming was the University of Wisconsin. They actively promoted the industry beginning in the late 1800s, and this was through scientific research. The first professor of agriculture, William Henry, used the university's farm to experiment with new dairy methods. And so that's something that's been happening for well over 100 years down in Madison at their experimental farms, and actually in satellite locations throughout the state. One of the ways we know that the word was getting out is that they were promoting the use of the cylinder-shaped silos for storing feed for cattle during the winters. And so it's not hard to see across our landscape here in Marathon County and Wisconsin that that idea certainly took root. Also, beginning in the 1880s, the university began offering agricultural short courses and winter courses in Madison. And that was to educate farmers about the benefits of dairying and efficiencies of this agriculture. So its farm institutes were held around the state, and it brought farmers and scientists together to share their ideas. So the Wisconsin idea of bringing knowledge to the people. One good example of that that you might be aware of is Professor Stephen Babcock, pictured here with his butterfat tester. And it was the first way in which they figured out a way to test for the butterfat content in milk. This meant that you could consistently make high quality butter and cheeses. And the apparatus became very common in usage, not just here in Wisconsin, but it became the standard for producing dairy. At the same time, great strides were made in milk pasteurization when the university's College of Agriculture was testing bacteria. And so, again, food safety as well. One final way that dairy becomes key to Wisconsin's success is professional organizations. In the 1870s, leaders of the growing Wisconsin cheese industry organized several professional organizations. Not only do they want to promote Wisconsin cheese, but they're also trying to convince farmers to give up their opposition to the cheese industry. There was a pretty significant transition that you had to make when you went from wheat farming to dairy farming. Because you're providing milk regularly to make cheese, that provides a lot more regulation to your day. And some farmers said it was a more confining routine. Today, cows need to be milked twice a day, and there's no way around that. Same was true in terms of being tied to your cows in your barn, going back to the 1800s. I know my family's always talked about those kinds of restrictions, and that you always had to think ahead if you ever wanted to leave the farm for more than a half a day at a time. But given all of those reasons for why we became America's Dairyland, and those factors that helped, by 1915, so right after the turn of the century, Wisconsin had become the leading dairy state in the nation. We were producing more butter and cheese than any other state. And so to see how that had an impact to today, first up, just a few photos. These are farms early on, so they're in the 1870s, and they happen to be in the Madison area, both in Dane County. To broaden it just a little, it wasn't just dairy. In the late 1800s, other Wisconsin crops started to take off. Cranberries go all the way back to the late 1800s. There was a time in which tobacco was grown, corn, hay, and fruits and vegetables. You might be aware that there's still a great deal of vegetables for food processing that are grown south of us, like in the Portage area, in Portage County. That has history back to the late 1800s. It was potatoes and green beans and carrots. Oh, I had a whole list. I'm sorry, it's potatoes, green peas, sweet corn, cucumbers, lima beans, and beets. And so Wisconsin soon produced more vegetables for processing than any other state in the nation. So as in vegetables as a cash crop, not just for subsistence eating. And that's by the 1880s. Also fruits as well. Wisconsin farmers figure out how to grow apples, cherries, and strawberries for market. But we would continue to be a grain state. By 1890, Wisconsin produced great quantities of grains other than wheat. We were first in the nation for rye, second in the nation for barley, and third in the nation for oats. So, taking a giant step forward to more than 100 years later, what does that mean for the state of Wisconsin today? Well, this is a map of how our land is used today when it comes to agriculture. And so in blue is dairy, and in red is cash grain. The other prominent color is orange, especially on the outer edges of Wisconsin, and that's pasture, hay, and grassland. And the bright spot of yellow south of us is what I referred to before, and so that's vegetables. Potato and grains as well, but it's still a vegetable growing area. I would guess you've seen the fields if you've driven down the interstate highway. We're going to transition then to look more carefully at Marathon County. So looking at this map, you'll notice that Marathon County today remains a dairy state, so that's in the blue. But you'll also notice almost an equal amount of red, and that's for cash grain. And we'll end my talk today talking about how that transition, what current trends in agriculture are like here in Marathon County. But let's start back in the 1800s again, and with the first white settlers. So let's talk about homesteading in Marathon County. Marathon County is just over 1 million acres, and that is larger than the state of Rhode Island. This photograph shows the great difficulties that faced early farmers. Families had to clear the land and then, of course, build a home and a barn before they could ever think about planting. And so this virgin forest land was a huge obstacle to overcome if you wanted to farm. So it did start with the lumber. In the late 1800s, lumberjacks cut down the forests, which opened up the land for farming. Both of these are pictures from Marathon County. And hopefully you can see on the photo on the left that if you look all the way down the large central tree, the people are tiny at the bottom there, just giving you a sense of this virgin forest landscape. And so the clear cutting of the forests happens, but of course they leave behind these huge stumps. It's at that same time that land is becoming much more scarce in the southern part of Wisconsin. And now with the trees cleared here, beginning in the late 1800s, people will move in. The white settlers will include people from the East Coast and European immigrants. So Marathon County agriculture starts with pictures like this of this land covered in stumps. Settlers to Marathon County, including especially German and Polish immigrants, were able to purchase the newly cleared land for $1.25 an acre. The publication, The Wisconsin Agriculturalist, in 1903, praised Marathon County as a farming utopia, with land getting quickly snapped up by newcomers. But there were lots of difficulties with starting a farm from scratch. The forests is a huge concern. So one of the good parts is that lumber was readily available. So you could have plenty of building materials to build log houses, and most often you started with a log barn. But the trees and stumps are going to cause a lot of headache and usually took years to remove enough to create enough fields to finally grow cash crops. At the beginning, it's mostly about survival. It's subsistence farming. And that's true for frontier farmers across the way. Of course, once we get to the late 1800s and in the 1900s, we often think of the little house on a prairie, and them worrying about the lack of wood, and having to deal with the sod of the Great Plains. Obviously, it's a different situation for homesteading in Wisconsin and here in Marathon County. Removing the stumps was just a slow process, and it's going to take a lot of manual labor. It could take months just to clear 3 to 5 acres of forest land. And you're aware that some of these trees, it would take at least 2 people to wrap your arms around. So removing the stumps just takes a lot of brute force. You couldn't just wait for the stumps to rot. Pine in particular is not going to rot quickly enough. You're going to have to actually dig and pull them out one at a time. Once you did get enough land cleared, plowing itself was incredibly labor intensive. Just in general in the 1800s, you're using a walking plow and it's harnessed to horses or oxen. Here's an example from Medford, Wisconsin, of clearing stumps, and you'll notice in the center they've created a machine to give them some leverage as they're trying to pull out these stumps. Also, so this is now subsistence living, trying to have just enough to get by as you continue to work on clearing your land. You've built a simple log home, a simple barn, you have some livestock, but early on, Marathon County farms weren't self-sufficient, and that meant in the winters, male farmers are usually finding a secondary income, and that's either working in the logging camps or the sawmills. In the summer, you are growing crops and vegetable gardens, but at this point, it's to feed your family and your livestock. So you likely either had horses or oxen early on, and a family cow just to provide milk and perhaps eventually to provide meat. Planting any cash crops, that means even going into dairy farming, had to wait until you could clear enough land. So here are some photos of the time of logging camps. The top one from the late 1800s in Marshfield, and the bottom in the early 1900s in Athens. In the 1890s, there were 450 winter logging camps and more than 1,000 mills in all of Wisconsin. In fact, near the turn of the century, 1/4 of all Wisconsin workers were in the lumber industry. And so you can think of a lot of these early homesteaders here in Wisconsin as part-time workers doing the heavy work in the winter. And then just a shout out to Wausau. You're probably aware that Wausau really is founded based on the logging industry. And so here you can see that in 1866. Once people are a little more established and can start to think about growing crops for market, this photo is a good showing of that transition, because the house on the right would have been the very first house they built. It's rather crudely done, but it gave them shelter. You can tell they're more settled because the house on the left is 1.5 stories, hewn lumber, just a much more sturdier structure. So you can tell they've had the time and resources to be able to build a much more permanent home. So it's at that point that you're looking at crops. And here in Marathon County, our first crops were hay, potatoes, peas, oats, rye, barley, and some wheat. The wheat mostly, though, is for consumption here on site. We do have records to show that they did try to grow apples, beets, and tobacco here, and they didn't really work out. I know for beets and tobacco, that has to do with our environment and that we're farther north than where they had grown it before. There was some livestock brought in of goats and sheep, but raising dairy cattle very soon became the county's specialty. And if you're going to have dairy, then you're going to have cheese factories. Cheese factories first appeared in Marathon County in 1891, and the creameries followed in 1895. By 1922, there were 157 cheese factories in Marathon County alone. The map below is from here at the Historical Society, and it's from just a few years later, 1930. And each red dot represents a cheese factory. And so you can even tell from the map that there is dairy farming being done fairly closely across the county, but you can see the density of the dairy farming in the western part of Marathon County. And so this is part of the industry then that, of course, before automobile milk trucks, the milk gathering was done by horse and wagon, as you can see above, in 1895, and then taken to a cheese house. And this one, the famous one in 1895 in Colby, where Colby cheese was invented. I just wanted to give you one example of an early farm family here in Marathon County. And if you go through just 3 generations, it gives you a pretty good idea of the evolution of agriculture here in our area. And so that's the Marquardt family. They were German immigrants. And it's Fritz, and he emigrated from Pomerania, that's the northern part of Germany, in 1857, and he initially was in the town of Hamburg, that's northwest of Wausau. He marries his wife Caroline in Milwaukee in 1861. She had emigrated from Germany as well with her parents in about 1857. So they moved to their homestead in the town of Hamburg, but reportedly they found it difficult because it was a long journey to get to their place in what felt like the middle of nowhere, and it was a really dense wilderness. And so anytime they needed to go for supplies, they found it to be a really arduous journey, which led them in 1865 to move to the neighboring town of Maine, again near Wausau, and they homesteaded 80 acres. They had to clear the trees, they built a log house, and they built the log barn, and they were growing grain, wheat and oats. They did have a variety of livestock. They had cows, pigs, sheep, and chickens. In the late 1800s, this was called diversified farming, and they thought it was best to rotate crops and have a diversity of products, including livestock. We know that he used oxen and later horses to plow. His son, Henry, inherited the farm in 1895 and doubles the size of it to 160 acres. Another son named Herman purchased a farm just a half a mile away from the family homestead in 1890. Like most homesteaders, he first built a log cabin, but he was doing well enough that about 1900, he built the brick house you see pictured. Now, Herman is the transition then to become a dairy farmer. So he's second generation homesteader here in Marathon County. And Walter, his son, took over what was now a 200-acre farm in 1935, working alongside his Uncle George. And they had about 30 cows. And they continued to farm with horses until they purchased a tractor in 1945. I know on the Kadonsky family farm, my family farm, although they even had motorized equipment, my father grew up in the early 60s with their family still having horses to do a number of the chores and tasks around the farm. I mentioned before professional organizations really helping and providing a support network for communities, and that was true here in Marathon County. I received this information from the Marathon County Farm Journal, which itself is a good support, that our own county had their own publication. And this information comes from September 1923. And here's just a snapshot of the organizations. Many neighborhoods had their own breed clubs, as in breeds of cows. So there was a Guernsey club, and there was a Holstein club, and several others as well. But they eventually decided to federate into county-wide groups known as cow testing associations. Some of the cheese factories chose to be part of the Wisconsin Cheese Producers Federation, so a state-level organization. There were 12 stock shipping associations, and there were 4 co-ops, Farmers Cooperative Produce Associations. They were in Athens, Colby, Elderon, and here in Wausau. And there were also 32 women's clubs. And so all of these are providing not just a social network, but professional support of each other. The banner of one neighborhood breed association gave 7 reasons why farmers should join their local breed club. Their motto was, every dairyman should join a neighborhood breed club. To highlight a few, they most often have to do with community and support for each other. Number 1, every farmer can make his influence felt in improving Marathon County's livestock. 2, an opportunity is offered each farmer a better chance for marketing his surplus stock. And 4, closeness of contact in developing cooperation and social recreation is afforded. So these organizations were really key, especially going into the 1900s. The support also came at the county and state level. By the 1920s, Marathon County had a county agricultural agent and a home demonstration agent. The first, Van Gell Russell, is pictured here, the extension agent, and also county nurses. We know that the county agent and the home demonstration agent were very busy. They traveled the county, and just some examples provided in the September 1923 edition of the Marathon County Farm Journal explained that they talked about topics like good roads, land clearing, poultry culling, and bees. And then there was the community support for farmers. In the 1920s, the support that they could get when it came to producing came from Wausau. There was a cooperative that it was a packing company. And of course, you needed a place to take your milk. And so that's cheese factories. And then the cheese warehouses to hold all this cheese until it goes to market. Marathon County really touted its transportation. There were networks of paved roads, or at least fairly stable roads, and the railroads had come through. And then we don't want to underestimate the value of rural schoolhouses. So these would be the more than 100 one-room schoolhouses throughout Marathon County. Yes, they taught young people, and as a teacher in my hometown of Wausau, of course I value the education they provided to the youth. But remember that these also served as community centers. As we're talking about these professional organizations and the demonstrations happening, they're oftentimes happening at schools and, quite honestly, also at churches as community centers. So this edition of the Marathon County Farm Journal ended with an invitation. in 1923 for others to join them. Marathon County welcomes the new settler. It offers much to the man with courage who can make his start and follow the helps of the many agencies at his disposal. Rear for himself a domain of independence in the largest and richest county in upper Wisconsin. And many of people took Marathon County up on that offer. Marathon County became one of the top dairy counties in the United States. But you probably are aware that over time, throughout the 1900s, dairy farms began to consolidate. And this was a result of new technology and also crops, such as high moisture corn that could be chopped and stored in silos. And so here are some figures. Beginning in 1929, there were more than 6,000 dairy farms, specifically in Marathon County, raising over 65,000 cows. If you fast forward 30 years later to 1950, there are just about 500 fewer farms, but they're raising significantly more cows, so the efficiency has gone up. By 1978, around the time I was born, there were only 2,000 dairy farms in Marathon County, but continuing to have a similar number of cows, more than 78,000. And for last year, the count was 433 grade A and grade B dairies, meaning significant dairy farms, not hobby farms with a single cow. And there were 64,000 cows here in Marathon County, producing 1.37 billion pounds of milk annually. So I'd like to wrap up by talking just a little bit about the current trends in Marathon County when it comes to agriculture. This is with brief research on my part. I am certainly in no way an expert. But with the collapse of the number of dairy farms, one of our transitions is that more land is now being used for cash grain, particularly corn and soybeans. So if you look in about the last 20 years, so this data was from 1999 to 2018, the percentage of land in Marathon County used to grow hay declined from 53% to 41%. What increased? Well, at the same time, soybeans increased from 3% to 17%. And corn went from 25% of our land usage to a third. Another transition is that Marathon County farmers no longer own most of their farmland. A majority of cropland acres is now rented out by a landlord. So that's another significant shift. And consolidation not only affected the milk producers, so the dairy farmers, but it also significantly affected milk processors. I said in 1922 there were 157 cheese factories in Marathon County alone. In 2019, there were 7 milk processing plants and 7 other businesses that were associated. So they shred, cut, and package cheese and other dairy products. But the impact is still significant. Based on some of the most recent data I could find in 2012, on-farm production and milk sales accounted for close to $350 million in Marathon County. And then processing milk into dairy products was another $1.68 billion. On-farm milk production also is more than 2,000 jobs in Marathon County in 2012, and the dairy processing is another 5,000 jobs. So here's a map from 2013. The green triangles are all of the dairy farms in Marathon County as of a few years ago. The black circles are dairy processing, and the few red circles or dots that you see would be meat processing plants. So again, a lot of the dairy is still being done in western Marathon County. And looking more globally at agriculture in Marathon County, beyond just dairy farming, significant ways in which people are making income include Christmas trees, ginseng, of course, maple syrup, small scale truck farms. So that means people who are growing vegetables, fruits, also horticulture. So these would be greenhouses and the types of farms that are growing for the market, like a farmer's market. And then commercial farms, all are part of our agriculture today. Agriculture is Marathon County's leading export. It's $41 billion of the total of $325 billion of products shipped out of the county. That must be millions. The agriculture industry contributes $2.5 billion in revenue and nearly 13,600 jobs in Marathon County's economy. So that's agriculture as a whole. So that's why this number of jobs is larger than just dairy. This is all agriculture in Marathon County. And if you look just in Wisconsin, by county, Marathon County in 2013 was first for the value of milk and dairy, second for the value of our crops and hay, and third in total value of agricultural products sold. So I always like to point out to my students that we see more agriculture in Marathon County, and it's a more significant part of our economy than the vast majority of the rest of the country. So that's a quick look at wheat and dairy farming in Wisconsin, and more particularly what dairy farming and agriculture means to us in Marathon County. And I appreciate your time and interest today, and I look forward to any questions.
Yeah. Okay, I guess microphone one isn't working. Okay, that's fine. We can just use this one. I'll just talk right louder. I just realized that both of our microphones were on the entire time, so hopefully there wasn't an echo. Sorry if there was. But yeah, as you said, if you have any questions, this is your call here. Because I have one that I can start off with. Obviously, we always kind of, or at least I've seen maps of Marathon County. Know that the western part was more heavily dairying than for example, the southeast side is where we have the potatoes kind of coming up from Portage County. But I was really surprised about that map that you had that showed the state, because it very clearly shows that it's not just the western Marathon County, but it extends into Wood County and Clark County and that side there. And yet it's interesting because a lot of the institutions that you talked about, the clubs, it's all at the county level. I don't know. Did you see much about? Because like for example, if you lived in Colby, like your family is from, they're right on the county line.
Yes.
So that must have been an interesting situation of, it's county specific, but yet it's a regional thing. It's not really a county thing. I don't know if you can speak to that at all.
I can't in the greater sense.
Yeah.
I think it is why we do get neighborhood breed clubs as the start. So that's grassroots. But they quickly realized that it made sense to be at least on a county level. However, a lot of these then have ties to state level organizations. And so that's where it would be perhaps more regional in scope. But I will say, again, my knowledge is with 4-H, and my father's family was Marathon County 4-H because they lived just over the border near Abbotsford. For a short time, my mother was in 4-H, but the Colby students who are in 4-H today tend to be in Clark County 4-H. It is actually truly based on address when it comes to that group, even still today.
Yeah, well, that makes sense, for sure. And it does kind of speak to the diversity. Obviously, you laid out some, and I think you did a good job of being kind of inclusive of the different varieties of things that can happen. But when we talk about the history, we are, like you said at the beginning, we're bigger landmass than the state of Rhode Island. There's a lot of different diversity in terms of, what happens here is not the same as over here. forgot the question that I was going to ask with that statement, though. But
And
guess
I didn't include the map, but with the University of Wisconsin providing scientific research, it's more than 100 years ago that they're starting to able to do some fairly basic soil samples. And
yeah.
so if you look at a map of Marathon County, the variety of soil is pretty amazing for just the diversity for something just the size of our county. And it does speak to, again, why the western half of Marathon County tends to be dairy and the southeast tends to have potatoes or
Yeah.
some other vegetables, depended on the time.
Yeah, that
Has
makes
to do with
sense.
quality of soil.
Another question that I had that was interesting. I know you talked about how the railroads opened up the West for the wheat side of things, and then that kind of gradually that's where the center of the grain basket of the country went. When we're talking about cheese that gets produced here, is that because obviously the milk you're not going to send that to New York or anywhere, but does the cheese? Do we have a sense of like where the cheese would be going? Is that still local?
I it's For a very long time it remains Midwestern
Okay,
is what I
Midwestern.
would
That's
say.
yeah, big way to think of it.
And that I'm not certain how far the reach could go, so I just don't have that knowledge
Oh, sure. Yeah, yeah,
until refrigeration.
yeah.
That cheese was definitely a better option than even butter, certainly milk. But there's a reason there were 16 cheese factories within 6 miles of Athens
Yeah.
in 1920. That was another statistic I came across. So it's very localized. And yes, trains are helping them broaden the scope. And marketing organizations like
Yeah.
that Horde begins start to, as they can produce more for further markets, the marketing really picks up as well. The phrase "America's Dairyland" is not by accident, right?
Oh, I'm sure. Yeah.
That this is very much a part of both things going hand in hand. The increases in technology, so that once we get refrigeration, but also trains especially, just allow more markets to open up.
And that the age old marketing of it too. You have great product, got to make people want it too. Cool. Well, I'm not seeing any other questions particularly popping up, but so I think maybe we can call it here. I don't need to necessarily keep giving you more questions here, but 'cause I think those are the ones that made you addressed a lot of them as time went on. Like for example, the bringing it in the 20th century was great. Because very frequently we just kind of go, yep, that's dairy farming, and then we don't talk about what happens afterwards, which is one way of doing it, but it's always good to get that perspective. So it was a great job with that. Yeah, so I guess thanks to everybody for joining us. I think we're going to call it here. Again, next month, if you're interested in another different but also I'm sure local story, the GAR, Brett Barker will be back. Oh, there's another question just under the wire here. I guess this is going back to Mr. Horde in the transitioning from that. Would he be the main focus, do you think? And it's kind of hard to judge, what percentages or whatever of that, but I don't know, anything else that you wanted to maybe say about that, or?
Just that he really gained in prominence over time. He even
Yeah.
went into politics at one point. And so obviously we're talking about these grassroots organizations. And so that is local farmers rolling up their sleeves and taking their valuable time to do what they think is best. But if we're looking at state leaders in dairy, the Wisconsin Historical Society will always point to him first as a state level
And I suppose
leader.
even just as giving the opportunity for people, just giving a platform to farmers to speak directly to them was probably super important, if nothing else. All right. Well, glad we caught that before we ended there. But yeah, I think we will end it here. So everybody have a wonderful afternoon, and we'll see you next time.